Now we will be moving on to Golgari, which is with one of the most hyped cards in Ravnica in Assassin's Trophy. Assassin's Trophy is red, green, instant, destroy target permanent and opponent controls. That's it. That's no other qualifier, just any permanent. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle their library. So this is a card that is getting a great deal of hype, primarily for older formats, where the downside of Assassin's Trophy can be heavily mitigated. A, because there are more ways to tax your opponent's basics. There are other cards like Path to Exile and Ghost Quarter that get more bases out of your opponent's deck, and they're not running that many to begin with, so you can get them to 0. Then cards like Assassin's Trophy don't have a downside. That's going to be harder to pull off in Standard, although actually there are the tools there to do that. I think that this card is going to be format defining for older formats, while merely just very good in Standard. This card's drawback is much greater in Standard than it is in the older formats, and it's important to note that for a couple reasons. A, as I mentioned, in older formats, people run a much lower number of basics, so it is realistic that you can run them out of basics, making Assassin's Trophy have no downside. The other thing is that older formats revolve around much cheaper cards, so even when you give your opponent extra mana, you're not really enabling them to cast anything they couldn't already cast. You may get them to a double spell turn, which is bad, but generally the downside is much lower than it would be in Standard, where this card pretty much becomes uncastable until the 4th turn of the game. You can't play this on turn 2. That's not a thing you can do in Standard. You'll just lose on the spot, just rampant growthing your opponent for free. Games of Standard revolve more around 4, 5, 6 mana cards, whereas the older formats revolve around like 1, 2, and 3 mana cards. So Assassin's Trophy actually acting as ramp, effectively time-walking your opponent, is a massive downside. In Standard, you're going to need to save this as a catch-all for your opponent's large haymakers like Aurelia or Niv Mizzet or whatever other giant things people are doing in the late game, when the fact that they're getting extra land doesn't really matter. They already have a bunch in play. So while I do think this card is very good, especially in older formats, it's important to understand that its applications in Standard are a bit more narrow because its downside is a much greater. That said, you can pair this with Field of Ruin, and the fact that mana bases are going to get a bit tighter on basics if our last expedition to Ravnica is any indication. For example, if you go look at the deck lists from Pro Tour Gatecrash, which was the last Pro Tour played with the Shockland, Buddyland mana base, I think the average number of basics in those mana bases were like 2 or 3. So it actually is similar to a modern format in that respect. If we end up getting back to that point, you can then start playing Field of Ruin alongside Assassin's Trophy and actually punish people for cheating on basics in that way. So for now, when we only have the 5 shocks, I think people are going to kind of be obligated to run a few more basics than that, making it a little bit harder to do that plan with Assassin's Trophy. But when the next Ravnica set comes out, we get the full mana base. That would be when I would expect people to start getting a little greedier. And in that spot, Assassin's Trophy can start being cheesed for no downside. So keep an eye on that. Right now, be conscious of how you use it, but it's also possible we get to a point where you can pair this with Field of Ruin and other effects to actually tax your opponent's basics to a point where this card has no downside. Charnel Troll. I thought this was Grave Troll, although I'm pretty sure it's already a card. In any case, Charnel Troll is a 3 mana 4/4 troll with trample. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, put a 1/1 counter on Charnel Troll, otherwise sacrifice it. And you can pay red and or green and a black, discard a creature card, put a 1/1 counter on Charnel Troll. So this is a big boy, big gentleman. But if you don't have a thing in your graveyard to exile, it just dies. Worth noting that you can play this with no graveyard, go to upkeep, in response to the trigger, activate its second ability, discard a creature, trigger resolves, eat the creature. That is a thing you can do. Your opponent could obviously like exile in response or whatever, but you can do that if you didn't have a way to put stuff in your graveyard on turns 1 and 2. So I think that this card is, depending upon how much we're filling our graveyard. Very strong. It's like massive. It can get even bigger. As long as you are providing fuel to it, and it is worth noting that this card is directly anti-synergistic with a lot of the other cards in Golgari. It hamstrings your Undergrowth cards. You might have to exile like Blood Operatives or something. So there is like legitimate, like hefty cost for enabling this card, but this card can just kill them. It's huge. So you have to kind of decide for yourself what you want to focus your graveyard interactions on. I think you can't do like Undergrowth and this. I think you have to either do like this or Undergrowth, or at least come to terms with the fact that your Undergrowth is going to be a little bit to quite a bit worse if you are enabling your Charnel Troll. So there is an interesting tension there, as there is with the spell creature split in the Undergrowth decks. It's actually going to be interesting to see how people choose to build the Golgari decks, because there is a lot of balancing and tuning that goes into it with cards like this, so that's cool. This card definitely strong enough to show up. It is just a question of what your graveyard synergies are focused on, whether you're enabling this or other stuff. Erstwhile Trooper is a 3-mana 2/2 that can discard a creature card to give Erstwhile Trooper +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. Activate this ability only once each turn. Because you can only activate this once each turn, it's probably not constructed playable. Generally, 0-mana discard outlets show up when things break, like stuff happens. Outside of that, this is like not a constructed playable card. It's too small. It can be a 4/4, but you're paying card to do it. Unless there are some like madness cards that show up in the next set or something, I would not expect to see Erstwhile Trooper in competitive play. Glowspore Shaman is a red... Bleh, why do I keep doing that? Is a black-green 3/1 Elf Shaman. When Glowspore Shaman enters the battlefield, put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. You're going to put a land card from among them, or from your graveyard. It didn't have to be in that pile you just milled, on top of your library. So this is one of the better enablers that Golgari has to fuel their graveyard, like curving Stitcher Supplier into this, and then you could do the Charnel Troll and it's probably fully fueled. I really like this card also lets you put the top card or a land on top of your deck. So that actually allows you to cheat on lands a lot. Because you're just going to be flipping over so much stuff with your Stitcher Suppliers and what have you and your like Surveil cards, that you could run like a 21-22 land deck, and because of cards like Glowspore Shaman and the Explorer creatures, if you're choosing to run them as well, you'll still be able to hit your land drops and get those slots freed up to not flood out, and also get this density of creatures to spells correct. So Glowspore Shaman I actually think is like a pretty key role player in the Undergrowth Golgari graveyard shenanigans. Just the fact that it kind of lets you cheat on lands seems worth quite a bit to me. Golgari Findbroker. This is the Golgari version of the double requirement card of the cycle. It is black, green, green, 3/4 Elf Shaman. When Golgari Findbroker enters the battlefield, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. There was a bit of discussion for various Magic personalities on Twitter as to the power level of this card. I think it is certainly justifiable to contend whether or not this card is good enough. I think it could certainly be good enough. It depends upon what you are getting back. I think we have seen throughout the course of this set review that there are actually a fair number of creatures that offer spell effects, and when that is the case, Findbroker becomes a much better card because it can only get permanents, but you just don't necessarily want to get like creatures that just like attack and block. You want to have this be a bit of a toolbox where you like mill over your deck and then you use Findbroker to get the thing you want and then answer the thing that was going to kill you, or like whatever is good against your opponent's strategy, etc. We may have a good enough swath of stuff with like that the Thoughtseize Bat and the new Fleshbag Marauder and some other stuff that actually do enable this card to act as that toolbox, which does then make it good enough. Like a 3/4 that draws a card, not really what you're looking for. That's like fine, but there's better stuff going on in standard. A 3/4 tutor a card, that's much better. And if you can get this to that point with your graveyard interaction, then that becomes worth it. Whether or not you can do that, very much contentious, but if you're able to make this a pseudo tutor, then it certainly becomes good enough. Izoni Thousand-Eyed is a 6 mana, double black, double green, 2/3 legendary elf shaman. With Undergrowth, when Izoni Thousand-Eyed enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token for each creature card in your graveyard. And you can pay a black and a green to sacrifice another creature, gain 1 life, and draw a card. This is a really cool card that I think is very powerful and certainly one of the better payoffs for doing Undergrowth stuff. You do have to get up to 6 mana, which is a bit of an ask in those decks, although depending upon how you choose to build them with explore creatures and stuff, you can certainly get there without running like too many lands. And the fact that you, say for example, you only have like 4 or 5 creatures in the yard by turn 6, which I think on average you're probably going to have more than that, assuming no opponent interaction. That's a really good card. A 2/3 that just, like, you get 6-7 worth of stats across 5 bodies. That's reasonably large game. And then if you could ever reanimate Izoni, like duplicate the trigger, blink it, whatever, then you got stuff going on. This is a card that I actually think has some applications in Abzan, mainly because you can get it off Militia Bugler. A bit of a Militia Bugler homer. There's a lot of really good Militia Bugler targets in this set. But there's also like ancillary synergies with tokens. You have more anthems in white, in Tristania card we'll get to later. So it's possible that you actually put this in a 3-color deck, not necessarily just straight up Golgari, although you certainly could just put this in straight up Golgari. Sultai is another option. But I do think that this card is quite powerful, and the fact that you get to, if you untap, like you play Izoni, you get like your 4 to 6 dudes. If you untap, you can just like chump block before damage, sack it, draw a card, sack it, draw a card. Like, you just have a massive brick wall in the ground they cannot possibly get through, and then you start to just draw cards and like start making forward progress that way. So Izoni seems like one of the more powerful top-end cards in the set. Pairs very well with the Genesis Spider we saw earlier. That's a very good hit. Getting Izoni off that spider is very, very good. So I think that this card will definitely show up, probably in a more top-end iteration of the Golgari deck. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, but it does appear that the tools are there for a bigger mana Golgari graveyard deck. Molder Hulk. Molder Hulk is a 9 mana 6/6. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. When Molder Hulk enters the battlefield, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, this is a card that's power level is contingent upon how early are you able to get it in play. Now, I think that the only way you could play this card and construct it is if you are consistently able to play it on turn 4. And that would mean you would have to have 5 creatures in your graveyard by turn 4. That is not unrealistic, but it is quite an ask. You could play this on turn 5. It's not the worst in that spot. It does like go in line with what we were just talking about, the prospect of a bigger mana Undergrowth deck where you're trying to get to cards like the Genesis Spider and Izoni. This helps you get there, and like both in the fact that it blocks and it ramps you 1. You almost, if you have enough creature cards in the graveyard, you also definitely have a land. So I do think Molder Hulk has potential. It depends upon how confident you are. You can just kind of turbo mill yourself in the early turns. We certainly have some very powerful enablers in Stitcher Supplier and the 2 mana 3/1, whose name I forget, that we just saw a minute ago. So if you can consistently get this in play on turn 4, or at least get it in play on turn 4 like 60 to 70% of the time, and turn 5 the rest, then it's probably a playable Magic card. If you can't do that, then it's not, in my opinion. But I actually don't think that that's unrealistic. So we will see if the tools are there to make that come together. Awkward Assassin is a 3-mana 1/1 with Death Touch. All creatures able to block Awkward Assassin do so. So this is more of a limited card. I mean, you could do stuff like with this in Constructed, like give it, pump it, have it attack, Plague Wind your opponent, etc. Not generally stuff you want to do. Mainly for freeing up some, acting as a removal in limited is its main purpose. Rhizome Lurcher is a 4-mana 2/2 with Undergrowth. Rhizome Lurcher is a battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So this card could be reasonably large, but it does not have trample or any other keywords. So say, for example, like compare this to Molder Hulk. This is like if you have 4 creatures to make it a 6/6, you're like 1 away from casting Molder Hulk. Molder Hulk also ramps you. It's actually weird how close this is to Molder Hulk. But in general, I think this card is probably worse just because its upside is lower than that of Molder Hulk. You don't get paid off as much for enabling this card as you would for a card like Molder Hulk, and it's unclear if it's even worth it to enable a card like Molder Hulk. Swarm Guildmage. This card's insane and limited, not very good and constructed. 2 mana, 2/2, 5 mana tap. Creatures you control gain +1/+0 and menace until end of turn, and 1 and a green, tap, gain 2 life. Yeah, that card's insane and limited. It's a little bit too slow and constructed. The Anthem effect is certainly powerful in both formats, but the fact that you cannot use it instantly, this you have to have a 2/2 survive, and then untap, and then have a board, and then attack, and asking too much. Undercity Uprising is a 4-mana sorcery. Creature you control gain death touch until end of turn, then target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. This seems incredibly narrow, even for limited. It's not something I'm particularly interested in playing. It's cool that like if you have like 3 dudes, say, and you give all of them death touch, you have the smallest one fight their biggest thing, and then presumably attack profitably. That seems okay, but it's a pretty narrow situation. Card you maybe play 1 of in your limited deck. Certainly not something I'm interested in Constructed. This is more so a card that I'm interested in Constructed. Underrealm Lich is a 5-mana 4/3. If you would draw a card, instead look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put 1 into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. You can also pay 4 life to give Underrealm Lich indestructible until end of turn and tap it. So this is a card that I think is very powerful in certain matchups. I'm not convinced that you can main deck this card after seeing how good the Boros decks are. It seems incredibly weak against the aggressive red decks. But against most other things, any of the slower decks, this card can certainly run away with the game. It makes all of your cantrips, we'll actually get to later, very strong. Your draw step becomes like very strong. You have a very good source of inevitability through Underrealm Lich. It can certainly like take care of the game by itself, but 4/3 is a bit small. 4 life is a lot to pay, especially when it negates the attack, and a lot of the removal in the format exiles. It's the way this is worded, it dodges Lava Coil, because Lava Coil needs to kill it first through the damage in order for it to get exiled. If you give this indestructible, it doesn't ever die in the first place. Although Vraska's Contempt and Necrotic Wound still kill it. Necrotic Wound, because it gives -X, indestructible doesn't stop that. So there are removal spells that the second line of text doesn't even stop, which is a sizable strike against Underrealm Lich. But there, at minimum, are going to be matchups where when you sideboard this card in, it's going to be the best card you can draw. And that's good enough. It reminds me a bit of Blood Baron of Vizkopa from last Ravnica set, where it was the best thing going on in certain matchups and pretty bad in other ones. Blood Baron was a bit more main deckable than this card, but it's a similar dynamic where its power level fluctuates pretty wildly based upon the matchup you're finding yourself in. So in slow matchups, card's going to be very good. It can run away with the game. You just like kind of turbo through your deck, and that's a big game. But in matchups where you are on the back foot, this is not what you want to be spending 5 mana on. When you're facing down Tajik and Aurelia, You do not want to spend 5 mana on Underrealm Lich. You are dead. So yeah, situationally strong, but has its weaknesses. And now we get to the Queen, Vraska, the Golgari Queen, specifically. Is a 4 mana, 4 loyalty planeswalker, +2. You may sacrifice another permanent. If you do, gain 1 life and draw a card. -3, destroy target non-land permanent with convert max 3 or less, abrupt decay. And -9, you get an emblem with whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. So this card is disappointing to me because it's a well-designed planeswalker with a bunch of incorrect numbers that make it largely unplayable. This could incredibly easily have been a 3 mana planeswalker. If you just made it 3 mana, made the +2 a +1, made the -3 -2, made it start at 3 loyalty, like, fixed it. Card's playable now, and it's not even remotely close to overpowered. Because the +1 or the +2 in this spot is kind of the focal point of this card, but it's not like actually a good planeswalker +1 because you have to sacrifice resources in order to get a card, so you're not actually getting a card. The way Vraska's +2 becomes good is if you actively want creatures to die. So, for example, things with death triggers like Stitcher Supplier or the 1/1 that makes a zombie when it dies, stuff like that. Although I think that's an Amonkhet card now that I think about it. But anything that actively wants to die, when you're +2ing Vraska on those things, then that becomes a reasonable exchange. When you're plussing Vraska to, like, sacrifice even, like, a token or a land, like, that's just bad. It's certainly not very good. So I'm pretty down on Vraska, and it's annoying because I actually like the design. Like, that +2 is perfect for a 3 mana planeswalker because it can't run away with the game early. Like, you can't accrue card advantage off the rip necessarily. You need to set up first, so your opponent has windows to interact with you. Totally should have been a 3 mana planeswalker, but instead we have this. So people will try and make it work. It is certainly possible that at some point during this card standard legality, we get a critical mass of enablers that make it playable, but I do not believe we have that right now, and I am not particularly interested in playing this card. Pitiless Gorgon is a 3 mana 2/2 Death Touch. Solid and limited. I do not believe we will need to go to this in Constructed. It seems a little bit too underwhelming. Rather just play a removal spell. Here's the rare Golgari split card. We have Find and Finality. Find lets you return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. And Finality is 6 mana. You may put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, then all creatures get -4/-4 until end of turn. This one is interesting because both effects are reasonably narrow, but the fact that, again, you get both on a split card does make it so the likelihood of one of them being applicable much greater. I do think that Find is reasonably strong, given the fact that the Golgari deck is likely to be milling over a lot of things. We've already talked about how there are a lot of creatures that offer pseudo-spell effects, so you can then use Find in the same way we were talking about Find Broker being used. Is that Find Broker in the art, by the way? That'd be kind of funny. Find with Find Broker. I get it. I get the joke. So maybe Find is just a better Find Broker. I could actually totally buy that. But offering that same ability to find the specific things you are looking for. So I think Find is a card you would probably run a couple of, even by itself in some of the Golgari decks. And then Finality, offering a sweeper, even an expensive one, but one that could potentially be one-sided because of the +1/+1 counters you get to put on your creature first. That's a reasonably powerful effect. It's a narrow effect, but it's a powerful effect. And when it's on a split card, you can run narrower effects like that because the odds that you hit one or the other's situation is just much greater. So Find a Finality seems like a card that I would be content to play a couple of in a Golgari deck, not like a 4-of card, but this will show up, certainly. I think so. And the last Golgari card is Status and Stature. Status is an instant. Target creature gets +1/+1 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. And Stature is 4 mana. Destroy target creature, artifact, or enchantment. We've talked about how a lot of the removal spells don't, or a lot of the creatures rather, don't necessarily need to be exiled, so other removal that offers different things to Vraska's Contempt could be more playable. And I do think that Stature is one of those cards where the flexibility of letting you kill artifacts and enchantments may, in certain circumstances, depending upon how the meta shakes out, be worth more than the exile clause on Vraska's Contempt. There will actually be some level of contention there. And the upside of getting status, a pretty narrow but reasonable combat trick, does give it a bit more flexibility. Now, I'm not sure how often you're going to be able to leverage status for profitability. If people are playing a lot of similar cards, then even the +1/+1 is going to be fairly useful a high percentage of the time. But mainly, I think the draw of this split card is Stature and the ability to add free roll, artifact, and enchantment removal to a deck that would normally have to sideboard such effects. So I think that this card, pending upon what the metagame shakes out as, will certainly be an option that the Golgari decks look towards. Now, as we've talked about, if you want to do undergrowth stuff, adding non-creatures certainly has a cost, and this doesn't even like scale with all of your undergrowth things, so it's possible this is just played in a more conventional Jund or Sultai or Golgari deck without undergrowth. But the flexibility on Stature is notable, and I think will lead it to see a fair amount of play over its lifespan.